Welcome, I'm Rudolf Rotenbach from Create Infinity, and today we're going to discuss the ownership element of BE in a little bit more detail. We're looking forward to giving you some insight into how BE works, but especially ownership, and then also some tips and tricks around ownership and how you can affect and work with it in your business. Yeah, looking forward to sharing this information with you today. Normally, when we talk about BE, people from the onset think that it's ownership. BE, in most people's mind, talks about how I need to give shares away, I need to give the rights of ownership to someone else and to allow them to take over my business. And that is not the case. Ownership is but an element on the scorecard. And ownership talks about shareholding, but there's also some sub-elements to it. So it's not just the giving away of shares to someone that you don't know or don't trust. There's some very smart ways that you can go about solving the ownership issue in your business. But I normally like to tell people that you look at the scorecard as a whole first, and when you realize that it's necessary to bring in ownership, do that, or if you have the correct partner or structure in place. So what is ownership? Ownership is the participation of black people in the rights of the entity. So the rights of ownership is voting rights. Secondly, it's also economic rights. So voting rights is a person or a company that has the right to vote on behalf of the company. So they decide what needs to happen in this business. That is voting rights. I'm sure you all understand what voting means. Second part is economic interest, and economic interest is the realization of money out of the business. And commonly we talk about dividends. If I have the right to receive dividends out of this business, I have the right to economic interest, and thus it forms a part of the elements of ownership. And we'll look at the next slide on that specifically. There are many ways that you can implement ownership, and it doesn't have to be an individual. It could be a black-owned company, it could be a CC, a co-op. A common way is to work with trusts, and then also some share incentive schemes or black shareholding schemes that companies bring up to incentivize their staff. Any of those that are black-owned could be a shareholder in a business, and that shareholding then equates to ownership and what comes through that. So you don't have to look at an individual only. There's also some nice structures out there in terms of equity funds and trust structures, options and rights. So plenty of ways that you can implement ownership. If you look at the different levels of your business, if you are an EME, meaning that your turnover is below 10 million rand, you don't have to go for ownership at all. You get a level 4. The problem comes in as soon as you breach that and you go to 11 million rand turnover, suddenly you have to implement the whole scorecard. And a quick solution could be to look at ownership changes. And if you're 51% black owned, you become a level 2. So there are some complications in there. Even if you are 51% black owned, as soon as you go over 50 million rand, you can only get to a maximum of 25 points, which doesn't even put you on the scorecard, which then means you need to implement the rest of the BE scorecard, skills development, management control, etc., to get on. So it's not just a matter of changing shareholding and you're good to go forever. Let's break down ownership and the structure on BE specifically a little bit more. So if you look at the slide, the ownership element is described here, and within it there are 3 main subcategories called indicators here. The one is voting rights, where we said, does a black person have the right to vote for this business? Is he a shareholder that has voting rights? And you remember, a typical example is on structured deals in corporate finance. You get that someone has voting rights, but he only owns 10% of the shares, but he can vote for 50%. So there are 2 separate types of shares, one with voting rights and one without. For BE purposes, we only look at who's allowed to vote. And if you can't vote, you can't claim the points. So voting rights is the first indicator. The second indicator is economic interest. And economic interest means the flow of dividends towards black people. So dividends is economic interest, and capital appreciation is also economic interest. So the growth of the business. If I have a type of share that gives me voting rights, but I cannot earn dividends through this type of share, I do not get economic interest points for that type of share. If I have a share where dividends flow, but I'm unable to vote, which typically happens, or a lot of times, that is voting right points, but no economic interest. So you need to be sure of how this is constructed. One other thing about ownership is that I can be an owner in a business, but not a director or a staff member. So if you think about the JSE, publicly traded stocks or shares, I buy shares on the JSE, I get dividends, but I am not involved in the day-to-day running of the business. Ownership and management control are two components, and a director isn't necessarily an owner. So it's very important to understand those smaller things. Further indicator, and the last one, is realization points. So that is a calculation that is that determines if value is created for the new black shareholder over a period of time. So you can't just give them the shares, but there's no benefit to the black person. So that calculation is done every year, and you can get up to 8 points for that. So if we move to the next column and we look at the description here, we can see that voting rights, for example, is broken down between black people and then black women. So you get different points if you have black people only, black men, but if you have black women, you get 2 extra points. So you can get 4 points if you have 26% black male shareholding. But if you have 26% black women shareholding, you'll get the 4 points and the additional 2. The same goes for economic interest. So if there's a woman shareholder with 10% voting rights or 10% economic interest, you'll get 2 points each for those 10%. But as soon as you hit 25%, you'll get the whole 6. Then the last thing I quickly want to discuss is the designated groups. So those are specific groupings of people. Amongst them, we get youth, we get share schemes, we get military veterans, and so on. Very specific ones. 3% of your shareholding belongs to those. You'll also get the additional 3 points. So very detailed breakdown of how your shareholding needs to look. You can't just get a black individual on board, owns 51%, you're level 2, and then you go over 50 million rand. Suddenly the breakdown of that shareholding and the detail of it is very important. So a few tips: get your structure ready from day one, look at female shareholding, and look at structuring it, not just looking at individuals, but rather a bigger scheme, structure, a trust, options, or something similar to enable you to gain more than just the 4 points that you can get everywhere. A few practical things is don't just sell your shares, don't just give it away. This is the last thing that you need to consider. So work with all the other things and then go through the share option or the share portion of it. Look at a structure, look at a trust, an NGO, look at share options where people buy into the business over a period of time, potential for preference shares if you like, so various structures that you can look at. And then you need to consider how much you're willing to give away in terms of voting and how much you're willing to give away in terms of dividends. And trust the relationship. Don't just go for the first person that comes up, but trust the relationship and make sure that you have a long-term future in this relationship. I trust that you have enjoyed this session. that you have learned something new today. You are welcome to contact me with any questions you have or any information that you want. You can also go and look at the website ownershield.co.za for some ownership structures and information around that, and to build your business around a structure that doesn't interfere in your day-to-day workings.